Everyone thought the lake was just water, quiet, still, ordinary, but to me it was life itself. I would stand at its edge in the early mornings, when the mist hung low over the water, when the world seemed half asleep, and cast my line with the kind of hope that can only be felt, not explained. That lake wasn't just where I fished. It was where I found peace, where I remembered my father teaching me patience, where I felt like the noise of the world couldn't reach me. But peace is fragile, and sometimes it's the people closest to it who shatter it. The first sign was subtle. I remember one morning pulling in my line, and instead of the familiar ripple of fish beneath the surface, I saw something strange, a film on the water. It wasn't natural. A dull, chemical sheen spread across the lake like oil. My stomach tightened, but I didn't want to believe what my eyes were telling me. I bent down, scooped a handful into my palm, and even before it dripped through my fingers, I caught the faint, acrid smell. Something was wrong. I told myself maybe it was runoff from the rain, or maybe algae bloom, something seasonal. But deep down, I knew I'd been around water my whole life. This wasn't nature. This was tampering. The next day, I brought it up at the HOA meeting. That's when the whispers started. "You're too obsessed with that lake," one of the board members muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. Others looked down at their papers, shifting uncomfortably. And then the president of the HOA, a man who always spoke with the kind of polished confidence that hides something sharp underneath, leaned forward and smiled. "The lake is fine," he said. "Maybe you just shouldn't fish there so much. It's not really what the community had in mind when we talked about preserving its beauty." I felt the sting of it. They weren't just brushing me off. They were telling me I didn't belong, that my connection to the water was inconvenient to them. That night I sat by the lake in the dark, no rod in my hand, just watching. The moonlight caught the surface, and I swear it looked sick, poisoned. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel peace sitting there. I felt loss. But I also felt something else, anger. You see, sometimes the places we love become more than just places. They become a part of who we are. And when someone tries to take that away, it's not just about water or rules or property lines. It's about identity. The truth came slowly, piece by piece. A neighbor whispered to me after one of the meetings. He said he'd seen something, men late at night near the maintenance shed, carrying containers, pouring something into the lake. He didn't want to be involved, didn't want to risk the wrath of the HOA, but his voice was shaking when he said it. That was the confirmation I needed. They were poisoning the lake, not by accident, not by negligence, but on purpose, to drive me away from it. And here's the cruel irony. What they forgot, or perhaps never bothered to think about, was that the very water supply for their pristine lawns, their gardens, their homes, it all came from the same lake they were poisoning. They thought they were targeting me, but in their pride, their arrogance, they were poisoning themselves too. When I realized this, I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel vindication. I felt heartbreak, because what kind of people would destroy something beautiful just to control it? I sat at the edge of the lake again, staring into the poisoned reflection, and I remembered something my father once told me when I was a boy. He said, "The water remembers. You can't harm it without harming yourself." At the time, I thought he was talking about fishing, about respecting nature. But now I understood it was bigger than that. The HOA wanted to erase me from the story of this lake. But what they didn't realize was that you can't erase someone whose heart beats in rhythm with the water. The question wasn't if they would suffer for what they'd done. The question was when. And as I sat there in the silence of a poisoned night, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This story was far from over. They thought no one noticed, but secrets spill faster than poison in water. It started with the kids. Their parents told them to stay away from the lake, to play in the cul-de-sacs instead. But children are curious, braver than adults sometimes. One of them, little Sarah from 2 houses down, came running to her mother with rashes up her arms, red and raw. She had been skipping rocks, just like children always had. Only this time, the water bit back. The HOA scrambled to explain it away. "Pollen," they said, "seasonal allergies." They spoke with that rehearsed calmness that only comes from people who already know the truth and want to bury it. But the mothers weren't convinced, and the whispers grew louder. What they didn't see was me, watching Waiting. I knew I couldn't come out guns blazing with accusations. They'd paint me as the angry fisherman, the problem neighbor who never fit the mold. No, I had to be patient, just like on the water. Line cast, wait for the pull. And then one evening, I saw it with my own eyes. The sun had just set and the cul-de-sac was quiet. I was walking the long curve of the lake when I noticed lights near the maintenance shed. 3 men moving quickly. They weren't maintenance workers. I knew every face that came and went from this place. One of them rolled out a drum, metallic and dented, while the others wrestled with hoses. I crouched low, heart pounding in my throat, and watched as they drained liquid into the water. It hissed when it hit. I wanted to scream, to charge at them, but I froze, every muscle locked. Because in that moment I realized something terrible. It wasn't just about me fishing. It wasn't about aesthetics or rules. They were doing this with purpose, and purpose meant planning. The next day, the HOA president smiled at me across the meeting room like nothing had happened. But his eyes carried that quiet warning. And I knew then they saw me as a threat. Weeks passed, the fish floated to the surface. Not many at first, just 1 or 2. But then more, silver bodies glinting like broken mirrors under the sun. Children stopped playing by the water entirely. Even the birds grew quiet. A dead lake is a silent lake. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, but none spoke up. Fear keeps lips sealed than loyalty ever could. They were afraid of fines, afraid of letters slipped into their mailboxes, afraid of being targeted the way I was. But me, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was furious. What they didn't realize, what they refused to admit, was that every drop they poisoned in that lake was the same water running through their pipes, filling their sinks, feeding their sprinklers. They thought they were destroying me, but they were drinking their own destruction every single day. The first sign of their mistake came quietly. The gardens that once bloomed in perfect rows started to wilt. Hydrangeas sagged, roses browned at the edges. Lawns that were once manicured to perfection began to die in patches, no matter how much they watered. I could almost hear the irony laughing in the air. But the real consequence, it came from the taps. A neighbor, desperate and frightened, confided in me one evening. "The water smells off," she whispered, glancing around like someone might be listening. "The kids won't drink it, even the dog refuses." She clutched her glass with trembling fingers, and then she leaned in closer. "Do you think it's connected to the lake?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Because in her eyes, I saw the truth dawning. The realization that in their war against me, the HOA had turned their weapons on everyone. Sometimes destruction doesn't roar like thunder. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, through rashes, through dead fish, through the taste of tap water. And when people finally notice, it's already too late. I stood at the edge of the lake that night, looking at its poisoned reflection, and for the first time in weeks I didn't feel powerless. I felt the current shift. Because the lake wasn't just my story anymore. It was theirs too, and soon they would have no choice but to face what they had done. Everyone said it out loud eventually, though never in public, never in front of the board. Something's wrong with the water. It wasn't just the taste anymore. Faucets coughed out brown streaks. Ice cubes froze cloudy and bitter. Clothes came out of the wash with a smell no detergent could hide. People started buying bottled water in bulk, lugging cases from the supermarket like survivors stocking up for a storm. And that's when fear turned into anger. You could feel it at every HOA meeting, bubbling just beneath the surface. They tried to keep the illusion alive, the crisp agendas, the polished smiles, but the cracks showed. Mothers whispered about their children's stomach pains. Gardeners complained about ruined soil. One man stood up and asked, his voice shaking, "Are we being poisoned?" The board president didn't flinch. "Of course not," he said. "This is a natural fluctuation. Lakes do this sometimes." Lakes do this sometimes. The room went silent, not because anyone believed him, but because no one dared to call him a liar. Not yet. But I knew, and worse, I knew they knew, the cover-up had begun. That night I sat at the edge of the water again, staring at the ripples. The fish were gone. The silence was heavier than ever. And I thought about how lies spread like poison too, quietly at first, then everywhere, seeping into trust, eating away at the core of a community until nothing is left. The next morning, a neighbor approached me. His name was Daniel, tall, quiet, a man who usually kept to himself. He looked different now, like someone carrying a weight he couldn't hide. "They told me not to talk to you," he said flatly. "Who did?" I asked. "The board." He paused, eyes darting toward the houses around us. "They said you're stirring up trouble, that if we ignore you, this will all blow over." I could hear the shame in his voice. He believed me, but he was afraid of believing too loudly. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper, creased and smudged. He handed it to me without another word. It was an invoice, bulk chemical purchases, dates, amounts, deliveries, all billed to the HOA. Proof. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I held the paper because this wasn't rumor anymore. This wasn't a neighbor's whisper. This was evidence. I looked up at Daniel. He didn't meet my eyes. "If they find out I gave you that, I'm done here," he muttered. "You didn't get it from me." And then he walked away, leaving me standing at the edge of the poisoned lake, holding the truth in my hands. That night I barely slept. The paper lay on my table heavy as stone. I knew what it meant. I knew what I could do with it, take it to the county, take it to the press, expose everything. But part of me hesitated, because once I did, there would be no going back. You see, sometimes the hardest part isn't uncovering the truth. It's deciding what to do with it. The HOA had poisoned the lake to punish me, to drive me away from the water that defined me. But now the whole community was drowning in the consequences. And I had to choose. Do I fight for revenge, or do I fight to save the very people who once stood against me? As the sun rose, the light touched the surface of the lake, dull and sickly, and I realized something. This wasn't just my fight anymore, this was bigger. The board thought they could control the story, but once poison is in the water, you can't control where it flows. And soon their lies would come back to them, stronger than the silence they'd built, stronger than the fear they'd spread. The lake remembers, and so do I. They tried to keep control, but control is a fragile thing. It slips through fingers like water. At first, the board doubled down. Letters went out to every mailbox, polite, professional, laced with just enough threat to remind everyone who was in charge. Your assessments are due. Your landscaping does not meet standards. Complaints about water quality are exaggerated and unfounded. But fear is louder than paper. Neighbors began to murmur in clusters on driveways, on sidewalks, out by the mailboxes, small groups that grew larger with every passing day. The whispers became bolder. Questions turned into accusations. The air in the neighborhood shifted. It was no longer me against the HOA. It was everyone against them. One night I was sitting on my porch when a group of neighbors approached, flashlights in their hands, determination in their eyes. Sarah's mother was there, her daughter's rash still visible weeks later. Daniel, the man who had slipped me the invoice, stood just behind her, shoulders tense. "We need to talk," she said. They gathered in my living room, voices hushed but hearts loud. One after another they told their stories: headaches, stomach sickness, dying pets, lawns crumbling despite endless watering, the truth spilled out, raw and undeniable. And then silence. All eyes turned to me. "You've been watching this longer than any of us," Sarah's mother said softly. "What do we do?" It hit me then how strange it was. For months I had been the outcast, the man the HOA painted as a nuisance, the one who didn't belong. Now here they were looking at me like I was their anchor. I didn't want that power, but sometimes life doesn't ask what you want. It asks what you're willing to carry. I laid the invoice on the table. The paper seemed to glow under the lamplight, heavy with truth. Gasps echoed through the room as eyes traced the words, the dates, the chemicals. "This is them," Daniel whispered. "This is proof." And in that moment the fear in the room shifted. It wasn't fear of the HOA anymore. It was fear for what had already been done, and anger at the people who had done it. "We can't let them bury this," one man said, his fists clenched. "They'll try," another replied. "They always try." But anger has a way of uniting people. And when neighbors who never spoke to one another begin to stand side by side, something stronger than fear is born. That week the board held another meeting. The room was packed, standing room only. Usually these meetings were half empty, people barely listening, heads down in their phones. Not this time. Not after the sickness. Not after the gardens died. Not after children cried from water burns on their skin. The president stood at the front, smiling like always, but the smile didn't land the way it used to. His words rang hollow. Everything is under control. The water is safe. Please stop spreading rumors. And then a voice broke the silence. It was Sarah's mother. She stood, trembling but unyielding. Then explain this. She lifted her daughter's arm, red and blistered. The room gasped. The president faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. Another neighbor shouted about the dead fish. Another about the stench from the faucets. Daniel stepped forward and slammed the invoice onto the table. The room erupted. Voices rose, people shouting over each other, demanding answers. The board tried to gavel it down, but the sound of wood against wood was swallowed by the storm. For the first time, the HOA wasn't in control. That night, as I walked home from the meeting, I felt something stir in me. For so long, I had been alone in this fight. Watching the lake die, watching the lies spread, holding my silence like it was my only shield. But now, I wasn't alone anymore. The neighbors had woken up. And the board, they had no idea how to silence an entire community. Sometimes, unity is born out of pain. Sometimes, the very poison meant to break us becomes the fire that binds us. And I knew then, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. The board thought they could scare us back into silence, but silence had already cracked, and once a voice rises, others follow. The retaliation came fast. Letters thicker than ever, laced with legal jargon. Threats of fines for overgrown grass, for cars parked an inch too close to the curb, for fences faded from the sun. They wanted to remind us they still had the power to choke us with rules. But fear had shifted sides. For the first time, neighbors compared letters. They knocked on doors they'd never knocked on before, held papers side by side, and realized it wasn't just them. The board was hitting everyone, anyone who had spoken too loudly, anyone who had dared to ask questions. That's when we stopped whispering. We gathered in garages, in backyards, in kitchens. We no longer tiptoed. We spoke of chemicals and sickness, of poisoned taps and dying lawns. And we spoke of evidence. The invoice had become our torch in the dark, a single sheet of paper that burned brighter than all the lies stacked against us. Someone suggested we call the county health department. Another suggested the press. I stayed quiet at first, listening, watching the determination flicker in their faces like candlelight. Finally, I spoke. If we do this, we can't turn back. They'll come after us harder, but if we don't, we're letting them win. The room fell into silence, and then one by one, heads nodded. The decision was made. We drafted a letter to the county attaching copies of the invoice. We pooled our money for water testing, sending samples to independent labs. The results came back laced with words that made us shiver, chemicals linked to toxins, not runoff. Proof, undeniable and damning. The board didn't know we had it yet, but we knew the storm was coming. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. Chairs filled, walls lined, the air buzzing with tension. I sat near the back, watching the board file in, their confidence still intact, their smiles rehearsed. The president began with his usual calm tone. We understand some of you have concerns, but please rest assured the lake is being maintained properly. These rumors of contamination are exaggerated. That's when Daniel stood up. His voice, usually soft, carried like thunder. Then explain the chemicals. Explain why your invoices show purchases of poison. Gasps rippled through the room. The president froze. He wasn't ready for a public confrontation, but before he could recover, another neighbor rose, holding the lab results high in the air. Explain this. Independent testing. Our water is poisoned. The room erupted. Voices collided, anger thick in the air. The board tried to gavel the chaos down, but no one listened. For the first time, the people weren't afraid of order. They were demanding truth. And then came the words that broke the illusion entirely. We're calling the county. It was spoken loud enough to echo, and suddenly everyone was shouting it, over and over. A chant, a promise. The board sat frozen at the front table, stripped of the authority they had wielded for so long. Their polished smiles slipped away, replaced with something I'd never seen before in them: fear. Because they realized what we had known for weeks. The truth was no longer theirs to bury. That night I returned to the lake. The water reflected the moonlight in dull, broken patches, but for the first time in months I didn't feel despair standing there. I felt something else. Hope. Not because the lake was healed, it was still sick, still dying. But because the people who had once ignored me, dismissed me, laughed at me, now stood beside me. And I thought of my father's words again. The water remembers. Yes, it remembers. But so do we. And the board, well, they were about to learn that when a community remembers, it becomes unstoppable. The knock came early one morning, sharp, official. 2 men in county uniform stood on the porch, clipboards in hand. Behind them, a white truck with the county seal idled quietly, its tanks and hoses gleaming under the rising sun. For a moment I just stood there, breath caught in my chest, because this was it. The moment the fight stopped being whispers and became real. "We're here to test the water," one of them said. His voice was steady, professional. But his eyes told me he already suspected the truth. Word spread fast. By the time they lowered their hoses into the lake, half the neighborhood had gathered to watch. Mothers clutching their children's hands. Fathers with folded arms, jaws tight. Elderly neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years stood shoulder to shoulder with teenagers recording everything on their phones. And for the first time, the board wasn't in control of the story. They were on the sidelines, watching nervously as the county men filled vials with the poisoned water. The president tried to regain footing, striding up with his polished confidence. "This is unnecessary," he said smoothly. "We've been maintaining the lake properly. These concerns are nothing more than—" "Step back, sir," one of the inspectors interrupted, not rudely, just firmly. And in that small interruption, the board's mask cracked. The samples were sealed, labeled, and loaded into the truck. The crowd watched in silence as the doors slammed shut. "Results will be back within a week," one inspector said. "Until then, I'd advise against drinking from this supply." A murmur ran through the crowd, against, as if they hadn't already been poisoned for months. The board shuffled away quickly after that, but the neighbors lingered. And for the first time, I saw something new in their faces. Not just fear, not just anger, but anticipation. The reckoning was coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the dark edges of the lake, listening to the insects hum, the faint lap of water against the shore. And I thought about how strange it was, this battle that began because I loved to fish. That was all. A line in the water, a quiet pastime. And yet, because of that love, I'd uncovered something that threatened everyone. Sometimes, the smallest passions carry the biggest truths. The week crawled by. The board avoided eye contact. Their letters stopped. The power they once wielded with paper and ink had dissolved in the face of something bigger. And then the results came. The county inspector returned, this time with a folder tucked under his arm. We gathered in the community hall, every chair filled, every wall lined. The air was electric with tension. The board sat at their table, stiff and pale, eyes darting like trapped animals. The inspector spoke plainly. "The water has been contaminated with industrial chemicals not naturally occurring in this environment. The levels exceed safe limits for human consumption and environmental safety." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children. Neighbors exchanged looks of fury and fear. The inspector continued. "Based on the purchase records submitted, he held up the invoice we had given him. It appears these substances were deliberately introduced." Deliberately. The word echoed like thunder. I looked at the board then, and for the first time I saw no polished confidence, no practiced smiles. I saw sweat beading on their foreheads, lips pressed thin, eyes refusing to meet the crowd. The inspector closed the folder. "Further investigation will determine accountability, but for now, the lake is officially closed. Do not drink from the water supply. Do not use it for irrigation. This community will be provided with emergency water services until the matter is resolved." The room erupted. Shouts, cries, the sound of decades of trust shattering in an instant. And me, I sat quietly letting it wash over me, because I knew this was only the beginning. Investigations take time, consequences take time, but the tide had turned. The lake might still be sick, but the truth had finally surfaced. As I walked home that night, I thought about what it meant. The board had tried to erase me, to poison the water just to drive me from its shore. But now, their poison had exposed them to everyone. Sometimes the water doesn't just remember. Sometimes it speaks. And when it does, it drowns lies faster than any man can bury them. It's strange how quiet a neighborhood can become when the truth finally comes out. No more humming in the mornings, no sprinklers ticking through the night. The cul-de-sacs that once gleamed with green lawns and blooming gardens now looked tired, thirsty, abandoned. People no longer waved politely as they passed one another. They stopped, they spoke, they shared. The illusion was gone. The board still sat in their houses, blinds drawn, cars hidden away in garages. But the rest of us, we carried the weight of what they'd done. Parents boiled bottled water for their children, their kitchens lined with cases of plastic jugs. Elderly neighbors, too frail to haul gallons from the store, leaned on younger families for help. Dogs whined at empty bowls until we poured the expensive, store-bought water into them. It wasn't just inconvenience, it was betrayal. One evening, I sat outside with Daniel. We hadn't been friends before all this, but now we found ourselves sharing silence together, watching the lake in the fading light. "My wife doesn't sleep anymore," he said finally. "She lies awake listening to the pipes in the walls. She says it feels like poison still crawling through the house." I didn't know what to say, because I felt it too. Every time I turned on a faucet, I wondered what lingered in the water, what stains we couldn't see, what had already seeped into our bodies. Sometimes scars aren't visible. The county sent trucks every few days, distributing clean water. Neighbors lined up with containers, exchanging quiet words, their faces weary but united. There was something sacred about those lines. Strangers helping strangers, kids carrying jugs too heavy for their arms, people laughing bitterly just to break the heaviness. We were surviving together. But in the survival there was also anger. A slow, steady burn that no amount of bottled water could cool, because the board still hadn't spoken. No apologies, no explanations, just silence from behind closed doors. One night a group gathered at my house again. Sarah's mother, her daughter's rash slowly healing. An older couple whose garden had once won community awards, now nothing but withered stalks. Daniel, shoulders heavier than ever. "We can't wait for the county," someone said. "Justice takes too long." "They need to pay," another added, voice sharp. The room filled with murmurs, the kind of murmurs that carry more than words. They carried pain, frustration, determination. I thought about my father again, his calm voice by the water's edge, the patience he taught me as we fished together. Patience had gotten me this far, but patience alone wouldn't heal this. So I said what everyone was already thinking. We can't let them hide, not anymore. The next day, flyers appeared on every door, not from the board this time, from us. We invited the entire community to a gathering by the lake. No agenda, no minutes, no Robert's Rules of Order, just voices, truth. When the evening came, nearly everyone showed. Candles flickered along the shoreline, a quiet protest against the darkness we'd been living in. Families sat on blankets. Children clutched their parents' hands. And for the first time, the board had no table to sit behind, no microphone, no gavel, just silence. Neighbors stood and spoke one by one. They told their stories of sickness, of betrayal, of fear. Sarah's mother held her daughter's hand as she spoke through tears. The elderly couple described watching decades of gardening die in a single season. Even Daniel found his voice, his anger raw but steady. I didn't speak until the very end. When I did, the night was quiet, the candles glowing like stars against the poisoned water. "They tried to take this lake from me," I said softly. "But they didn't just take it from me. They took it from all of us, and in doing so, they revealed who they really are. We may not be able to fix this lake tomorrow, but we can choose how we move forward, and I say we move forward together." The crowd fell silent, not because my words were perfect, but because they were ours, shared, earned. That night I saw something shift. Betrayal had bound us together. Suffering had made us stronger. The board could hide behind their doors. The county could take its time. But the community had already chosen. Sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. Sometimes it begins on the shore of a poisoned lake, with neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, deciding they will never be silent again. They thought they could outlast us, that if they stayed quiet long enough, if they pulled the blinds and hid behind lawyers, our anger would fade. That's how power works, isn't it? Silence the storm until it dies on its own. But storms don't die when the air is poisoned. They grow. The county hearings came first. Subpoenas were issued. The HOA board was called to testify. For the first time, their polished confidence had to face questions they couldn't gavel away. Cameras were there too, local news crews setting up outside the courthouse, microphones catching every tremble in their voices. The evidence was laid bare. The invoices, the chemical reports, testimony from neighbors, the inspector's findings. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself into a picture too damning to ignore. And then came the verdict: negligence, deliberate contamination, misuse of community funds, criminal charges pending. The board members didn't walk out of that courthouse with their heads high. They slunk out, faces pale, reporters chasing them with questions they couldn't answer. The community watched it all unfold on television, some with tears in their eyes, others with bitter satisfaction. Justice had begun. But justice is slow and scars are not. The lake still lay sick, its surface dull, its silence heavy. Families still carried bottled water into their homes. The grass was still brittle, the garden still lifeless. Healing would take years, maybe longer. And yet something had changed. I saw it in the way neighbors greeted each other now, not with polite nods, but with real warmth. I saw it in the kids running through yards together, in the families sharing meals, in the way we leaned on one another when the weight felt too heavy. We were no longer a collection of houses bound by rules. We were a community bound by survival. One evening, months later, I returned to the lake. A few fish had begun to return, tiny flashes beneath the surface, fragile but alive. I stood there with my fishing rod in hand, though I didn't cast it. Not yet. It wasn't time. Instead, I closed my eyes and listened. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't dead silence. It was waiting silence, the kind that comes before something new begins. I thought of my father then, his voice by the water telling me that the lake remembers, and I realized he was right. The water does remember every kindness, every cruelty, every truth. The HOA had tried to erase me. They tried to poison not just a lake, but a man's peace, a community's trust. And in doing so, they poisoned themselves. But we endured, we spoke, we stood. Sometimes healing is not about erasing what's broken. It's about choosing to carry the memory forward, stronger for the scars it left behind. As the sun sank low, painting the poisoned water gold, I whispered to the lake, as if it could hear me. "We're still here." And in the faint ripple across its surface, I almost believed it whispered back,